So through this talk, I hope to demonstrate that landscape discourse must continue to engage with the messy afterlives of visuality to understand the complex relationship between citizen and landscape. As I will briefly outline, and I'm sure many of you here are well aware, landscape visuality has been central to the colonial control and classification of both land and people. But it is because of this hegemonic role, and not in spite of it, that I insist that we explore the continued visual construction of landscape. Firstly, because it's important to consider the complex afterlives of colonial visuality that are recursively folded into the present. And secondly, as indicated by the title of this talk here, the provocation is inspired by Nicholas Mirzoeff's works on the right to look and conceptualizes counter-landscape visuality as a force of enfranchisement for citizenship and agency in the construction of other or alternative landscape imaginaries. So to begin, while there is no commonly prescribed definition of landscape, throughout its evolution, the term has involved the relationship between land, its social uses, and its visual interpretations. Today, I'm focusing more specifically on one of the inherent tensions in the term, that contrast that we've heard a lot about so far between observing and inhabiting land. I think this is one of the most important and meaningful tensions that we engage with as landscape architects in our role in both representing spaces, ecologies, and human occupation, but also in creating these spaces for inhabitation. And here we have James Corner theorizing the constitutive relationship between image and landscape, underscoring the significance of visuality within the landscape tradition, even in a piece and even as he's attempting to deconstruct the salience of a singular landscape image. More importantly, however, landscape has been, as Cosgrove, who we also have heard about today as well, as Cosgrove articulates here, a way of seeing that has upheld hegemonic control of land. And for Mirzoeff, who I just referenced previously, and here I'm quoting, the authority of coloniality has consistently required visuality to supplement its deployment of force. Visuality sutures authority to power and renders this association natural. So if visuality within the landscape tradition has been fundamentally linked to the projects of colonialism and modernity, then its legacy must be understood as a way that racial classification has been reinforced. And such an incriminating analysis has led some to emphasize other ways that landscapes are known and constructed. So a growing body of work suggests that alternative understandings of landscape, including landscape phenomenology, along with a turn towards embodied and in-place understanding of landscapes of practice that provide ways of eroding, totalizing, and encompassing knowledge claims with the textures of everyday lived experience. These approaches do important work to consider the complexity and multiplicity of landscapes as formed through the experiences of daily lives. However, and I'm really not trying to start any fights today. However, as this embodied turn in social sciences has been taken up within landscape discourse, it has sometimes taken the place of visuality, suggesting the possibility of moving beyond previously visual definitions of the term. And this theoretical configuration suggests the possibility, I am proposing today, that this theoretical configuration suggests the possibility of a rupture with colonial understandings of landscape, which is a configuration that Anne-Laura Stoller indicates only further reinforces linear conceptions of time, which are obviously a construction of modernity themselves. Instead, by engaging with the extensive visual culture of landscape, we can work with topological understandings of time that allow us to conceptualize how the traumas of colonialism are folded into, exist alongside, and are obliquely agentic in the present. It is to some of these recursive folds of visuality that I'll now turn. So in a room full of people interested in the study of landscape, this Bonpland drawing in Humboldt's Geography of Plants likely doesn't need an extensive introduction. However, I will note its significance as it maps onto altitudinal space, the locations of plant species, which is what Humboldt develops into the Geography of Plants. Around this time, The discovery and classification of plant species by botanists is happening across the world as a colonial enterprise, while the imaging of botanical specimens is a central part of modernity's visual culture. The Andes were critical to Humboldt's understanding of elevation and vegetation, and here specific bands of specific species are arranged onto the elevation of the typical mountain within the Andes. This drawing has influenced not just the representation of landscape, but entire landscape epistemologies, how biomes, microclimates, and landscape ecologies are all in fact thought. Perhaps most strikingly, we can see the images of Bonpland and the thinking of Humboldt folded into and upholding the scientific authority of this recent landscape project coming out of Penn. The scale of an atlas for the end of the world here uses broad strokes and problematic data sets to suggest biodiversity hotspots that need protection from conflict with growing population. The way that urban growth and human settlement is characterized as a menace to environmental conservation here completely eschews the conversation about the colonial, political, and economic factors that have constructed this very landscape and the populations within it. Following Humboldt, and just after the independence of Nueva Granada, which would later become Colombia, the new nation commissioned Italian cartographer Agustin Codazzi between 1850 and 1859 to map and survey the nation. The timing here is really important, as it's a state-building exercise used to control land and survey resources, particularly in border regions that are kind of experiencing a large amount of violence, and we actually have just had a war with Venezuela at this time that is seen as a very kind of big threat on the borders, but there are other threats as well. So the commission mapped, but also produced hundreds of landscape paintings, like this one, that sought to characterize the landscape. These configurations set out by Codazzi and the commission in general persist as the landscape categories and regional identities of the country, and was also responsible for the classification of indigenous and Afro-descended people who they met, and who often served as guides and informants, but here are placed into the landscape as only inhabitants and not the kind of subjective beings, and I mean life-saving beings for the Codazzi Commission in many cases. Here, Los Llanos, in the northeast of present-day Colombia, are painted as a vast space. And in fact, there is some debate as to whether or not these cows in the front of this painting were actually there, or this is a kind of suggested use that would have been painted by Manuel Maria Paz, who was on the commission as well, to position the lands in the east as potentially valuable resources despite lacking the lush vegetation and landscape of plenty, imaginary of Amazonia to the south. But specifically, however, throughout the East, the commission had a difficult exhibition because of illness and other mishaps. Equipment broke, the weather was bad, and these experiences have been woven into their descriptions of the landscapes that they were experiencing them in, and also have been applied to the people that they met along the way as inherently violent and irrational people. Here, in an oblique reworking of Humboldt, the indigenous and Afro-descended people are placed into the landscape, fixed in place, and categorized alongside landscape topologies. Since I'm not considering time as linear, and instead topological today, we're going to move very quickly into 2015. In which the colonial construction of landscape and marginalized groups is woven throughout Colombian histories. However, here we have evidence of how it is folded into the characterization of the FARC. Here, the regional divisions of the Colombian landscape has been specifically mobilized extensively throughout the most recent civil conflict. Specifically, the FARC here is positioned as existing within the ungovernable jungle, with very little conversation about actually the political realities of why they are positioned in the jungle, and instead of a kind of assumed placement of these people into the landscape of the jungle. Again, the rationality of the people who then inhabit this jungle landscape is called into question, not because of what they are asking for in terms of their cause, and not because of the political realities of inequality, but in fact, simply because of the space that they occupy. So here, Toby Muse in this article suggests that the FARC fell victim to something I'd like to call jungle logic, things that make perfect sense when discussed in a jungle camp, but appear horrific to the rest of the world. So while I think that the continued engagement with landscape visuality is essential to articulate and contextualize dominant landscape and subsequently social imaginaries that we're seeing kind of folded throughout these histories here, I'm now going to turn to examples of counter-visualities, which extend what Mirzoeff calls the right to look to those marginalized from the construction of landscape through visuality. And while not every image I'm going to show is directly in kind of direct opposition to hegemonic visuality today, this archive of visual materials can subvert, manipulate, or otherwise trouble colonial visual constructions of landscape within the present. I've categorized these into kind of three broad categories. The first being magical realism. And although the term is used to describe a literary genre, most famously articulated for most people here probably, by Gabriel Garcia Marquez in 100 Years of Solitude, the characteristics of this literature can be observed in visual materials coming out of Latin America around the same time. Well, this one's much later, but and this is really what's allowing to happen in this image, is artists are able to question and manipulate the visual landscape tradition. So specifically, this post-colonial genre is distorting time, which I think is extremely significant in this case, and often incorporates magical elements to describe the conditions of what Mary Louise Pratt terms the contact zone. Visual works, such as these by Jose Gamarra, fold and compress time to bring the episodic events, or sometimes perceived as episodic events, of coloniality and imperialism alongside one another to demonstrate the recursive experiences of marginalization and violence that are in fact prolonged, and I would suggest kind of more of a surface and sometimes a crumpled surface of time. And so here we have a painting which translates to 5 Centuries of Storm, in which you have both a representation of a contact-like scenario, so you have a kind of Columbus contact-like scenario happening in it, as well as planes that depict oftentimes in Gamarra's work US imperialism within this landscape painting, bringing the long history of coloniality and imperialism kind of together within one image. And then again, we have a painting called Missing in Action, which is, again, bringing together the tradition of landscape paintings that we're seeing within Khadazi and we're seeing within Humboldt, but actually placing helicopters and oftentimes speaking directly to the kind of long legacy of counterinsurgency war within Latin America that the United States is participating in throughout the Cold War. And in this kind of other form of visuality, much as in the literary genre, the use of metaphor is also often used as a way of making radical political statements to counter ongoing imperialism and coloniality that are played out within the landscape. Okay. The second categorization of these counter-visualities that I think are effective and important way of kind of rethinking the relationship between visuality and landscape, is montage, collage, or the cut-up method. So the montage and associated cut-up methods that dissociate and reconfigure fragments from across temporal and spatial positions are of further significance as forms of visuality that challenge landscape hegemony. These methods are also a way that a multiplicity of viewing positions and timescales can be brought into one image, shattering the logic and objective ruse of the linear perspective, which Cosgrove was previously theorizing. As James Corner suggests, and here I'm quoting again, these qualities of simultaneity are what montage achieves most beautifully. The simultaneity of presence and effect, map, horizon, mood and temperature, all at the same time, haptic and plural intellectual qualities over purely scenic and painterly effects. And here we have Marin, a Colombian conceptual artist who's doing a lot of work in Sao Paulo at the time, actually, producing a montage image to reconfigure racist anthropological work of the National Geographic and bring it into the image with more contemporary deforestation happening in the Amazon at the time. And another example of this is Antonio Berni's work, in which collage and kind of the more exploratory version of collage using a large number of materials has been an important medium here and in a lot of Berni's work to represent imperialism and capitalist cultures of consumerism that are themselves constructing landscape through this, in a lot of ways, actually a kind of waste landscape. And this work is bringing together the refuse material of the commodity chain to form landscapes and reconsider their texture and position within the fabric of everyday lives. And there's an entire series of these paintings as well. And then thirdly, I'm going to speak a little bit about visual ethnographic methods as the kind of third categorization of these countervisualities. I'm sure there are many more. These three are all kind of focused within my area of research, which is Latin America and Colombia specifically. And so while the origins of sketching and visual documentation has its roots in colonial and frankly racist anthropological methods, the reworking of these methods provides insight into the possibility for nonlinear interpretations of landscapes as relational and contested spaces. Exploring the role of the composite drawing within notebooks, Michael Taussig specifically presents sketching as a way of taking apart the linear narrative of thick description. I appreciated Dane's sketching earlier from your fieldwork, actually. And so, in fact, if anthropology is often referencing the thick description, there's a linearity to the construction of sentences and the construction of paragraphs in the way that the written word is conveying information. In Palma Africana, where these images are taken from Michael Taussig, and I swear I saw this, Taussig's images become more than simply illustrations in support of a text, and instead are considered a way of observing and describing an assemblage of artifacts, people, environmental considerations, and political actions that exist in these kind of complex relationality that's structured by the folds of coloniality. And so in describing the different elements that are arranged on these pages, and in describing them in a nonlinear way, Taussig finds it a very helpful way of understanding, in fact, how these landscapes are indeed relational using this form of visuality. And visual ethnographic methods that engage research subjects in the creation of visual materials are another way that suggests the possibility of subverting the tendency towards the colonial gaze in ethnographic methods. So this here is a landscape that is considered the site of potential tourism development since the peace accord in Colombia. And it's kind of seen as a place that could really develop as an ecotourism site in the southeast of Colombia, with conventional landscape images like this one being published online, on tourism blogs, on social media, Instagram. It's an extremely striking landscape when framed in this way. But here I present a work that was created in a series of art workshops with former combatants from across the conflict, actually. So from counterinsurgent groups, paramilitaries, the army, as well as the FARC and other guerrilla groups. I think that this image is really able to trouble and subvert the previous photograph. It's quite obviously the same landscape, with the stories of violence that frame these landscapes and kind of reveal the complex ways that image and experience are intertwined and oftentimes actually inseparable. So in Maria Lilia's piece, which is entitled, the translation of that is Bitterness and Suffering in the Portals of the Fragrita River, the striking landscape is framed to mimic the tourism and travel photographs that we saw previously. But while the story and actions painted depict the experiences of violence that have been experienced, and in fact have actually formed this landscape and informed her experience of this landscape. So Maria joined the FARC when she was 20, and she was in the FARC for 3 years, and during that time, this extreme violence occurred in which this man on the cell phone in the front, ratted on the FARC in the mountains and called in the army, who then attacked and killed her commander. And she jumped into the river with her commander, who had by then died. And they were carried downstream, and she pulled him out, and that's him bloody at the front. But then kind of also speaking about this landscape of violence that's constructed through extreme violence, you have actually in this top corner, you have the rat, who is now tied to a tree, much like this center tree that Tausig is talking about, who is tied to a tree and being tortured for telling on the FARC. And so actually in this very complex painting, you have a lot of stories being revealed in the landscape, but they're being revealed in a way that is inherently visual, and quite clearly from the framing of this image, or the framing of this landscape, it's actually quite evident that there is a recursive folding of these other images of the landscape that are being produced into Maria's perception of what that landscape is like, knowing that this is a person that inhabited that landscape and was actually inside of that kind of thick vegetation, and this is still how she has chosen to paint that landscape, is I think a really important thing for understanding how we conceptualize current forms of landscape visuality within our understandings of these other kind of counter-visualities that are possible. And so to conclude, and to be more specific, I'd say about landscape citizenship specifically, through these counter-visualities, while hegemonic visuality, or visuality one, as Mirzoeff would say, has thought to place racialized bodies within colonial constructed landscape imaginaries, in much the same way as Humboldt is placing particular plants in terms of the landscape that they belong in. These plural, and I really do stress the plural of that counter-visuality, or these other visualities, I'm not totally comfortable with the use of the word counter, suggest alternative formations of landscape with multiple subjectivities that allow the fissures in totalizing visual knowledge claims to become apparent, and are also some of the ways that marginalized populations become, or have always been, agentic in the formation of their specific relationality to landscape subjectivity. Thank you.